would you consider yourself a disruptor of watch brands? And the reason I ask is because the Swiss watch industry, from what I've seen working at Chisholm Hunter, it can be quite old-fashioned in a lot of ways. And I mean, I say that with the greatest respect. However, comparatively, you're looking at the fashion industry, it's so fast-moving. The luxury industry is a little bit slower, as it should be, because luxury items last a lifetime. But typically, older fashioned brands or slower moving brands don't like things going against the norm. So would you say that Christopher Ward is maybe disrupting that a little bit?
We never use the word disruptor about ourselves. Other people have done. I think after 20 years, we're probably no longer seen necessarily as a disruptor. I think what we would prefer to describe ourselves as is sort of innovators. It was reasonably innovative 20 years ago to decide to be online only, selling watches, when people really believed that you would never have a business that could sell these sorts of products at these sorts of prices online. But then in 2004, people thought you'd never sell clothes online. So, the world keeps changing. I think the industry has a tendency, and probably appropriately, towards conservatism, and to be quite slow-paced around lots of things. I think because of our background, my background, Peter's background, in the early days, Chris's background, were not in the watch industry, and I for instance spent most of, before I got to toys, I'd spent most of my life in the fashion industry. Where you are used to rapid product development, where you're used to constant change. So it seemed natural to us that we should be looking to be pacey around these things, whilst making sure that quality wasn't compromised. And I think one of the things that we have done is, and people are always still surprised at the speed of our development, but I think we've brought a pace to our business which not all of the industry is able or wants to follow, and that's perfectly fine. But for us, it gives us an advantage, I think, in terms of the way we think, and it leads to, in some cases, new ways of developing product. And product will always be at the core of any business. It should be, that's for sure. It's certainly at the core of ours. And so, for instance, when we brought out our own movement, Calibre SH21, 10 years ago in July, that for a business of our size at the time was considered a remarkable feat. Not only because it took us about half the time it would normally take a brand to develop its own movement, and it wasn't just any old movement, it was a 120-hour power reserve COSC certified movement. It also cost us a fraction of the development costs that it normally costs a brand to bring out a watch movement. And the reason for that is we were blessed, it has to be said, back to having good fortune. We had a master watchmaker called Johannes Janker at the time. He'd been at Langenson previously. And Johannes was a young man, I think he was only 27, 28 at the time he developed Calibre SH21, which is quite remarkable. Very innovative in his thinking, thought outside of the box. He was using techniques at the time and manufacturing processes at the time which were more akin to the medical instrument industry than the watch industry. We were getting prototypes created much faster than was historically the norm in the industry. And that allowed us to bring SH21 to market in about 4 years at a fraction of the cost that it would normally take us. Now, the industry has only just begun to adopt some of these principles. And we were doing it 10 years or so ago. And that's because I think we we just wouldn't accept the mores that dictated how things were done in an industry that had done these things this way forever. And I suppose if that's disruptive, then that's disruptive. It's probably because we know no better, or we've always been doing things in a different industry. I still think the watch industry is the most, or one of the most backward in terms of its supply chain. When you've had for the last 40 to 50 years, from the early days of the Japanese car industry, for instance, having just-in-time principles being adopted to manufacturing, where literally doors would be provided to the production line minutes before they're required. We are working in an industry whose practices have been there for years, and an industry that seems quite happy to have extended pre-order times, extended shortages, and that's anathema to us. And I suppose one of the things we're in the process of doing at the moment, it's not disruptive necessarily to anybody else, but it's just helpful to us, is trying to rework elements of the supply chain to bring them into the era that most other sectors of industry were adopting from the 80s. And so we're one of the things we're really intrigued and interested in now is how we can shorten lead times, how we can better prepare ourselves for higher volumes in more sophisticated products without having to have long pre-order times. So supply meeting demand is inbred into us as something we want to do. So I find it astonishing that that isn't necessarily always the order of the day in the industry.
And that's a huge frustration from what I can see on the online space within the industry is, I walked into a boutique, they said, you'll get it in a year. And I said, well, I'll spend my money elsewhere because why am I going to wait a year? And you're absolutely right. The fashion industry is miles ahead, especially from like the online perspective. Than more luxury watch retailers. I know that within the business that I work in as well, there was, I suppose maybe disruptive isn't the word you want to use, but there was definite things that we did that went against the grain and went against the norm and possibly could have upset people because it was against the norm, and for a typically old-fashioned business, they didn't like that change. And through those, that stretch brought Chisholm Hunter as a brand forward and grew the brand. But obviously that came with difficulties. So when you look at Christopher Ward as a brand, obviously you're doing these fundamental things with the supply chain. You're doing brand new things, and I can see this from a quote unquote influencer point of view with the YouTube segment of the market. What are the difficulties that you've faced within those changes to the brand?
You're talking about the supply side changes.
Well, just any changes that you wanted to make to Christopher Ward that maybe had that they weren't seen before. So possibly people would say, well, we've never done it before, so how do we know it will work?
It's hard to say. I mean, even simple things like we were astonished that the quick release strap system, which we have sort of pioneered, in the early days when we suggested this must be the way forward, we were told that no, that isn't how proper watches are constructed. And so you're actually you're having conversations with people and you're saying, look, this is just a fantastic way to give the consumer a better experience, give the consumer more choice, give the consumer the opportunity to change out straps on a regular basis, creating new looks for their watches, back to the fashion industry in a sense. And to be told that's not how we do things around here, delayed us getting into quick release for a while. That was very frustrating. We were still one of the very first to introduce them, and one of the very first to introduce them onto bracelets. So in the first instance, it was, you can't do that on leather straps, or and then we wanted to do it on bracelets. Well, that was almost anathema. And you go, well, and that it's that sort of closed-mindedness. There is it's famously George Daniels, of course, having created and invented the coaxial escapement, spent years, literally years, in conversation with the watchmakers at Patek Philippe. Here he was presenting them with probably the greatest innovation in watchmaking in 200 years. And they were obviously welcoming him into their offices, in their white coats, no doubt, primarily just to filibuster him, and it went nowhere. And in all fairness, credit to old man Hayek at the Swatch Group, who eventually realised that this was an incredible invention, and now Omega are, along with Roger Smith, are the only people who use coaxial escapers. So there you this belief that the lever escapement is the only way it can be done prevented, in my view, Patek becoming an even better brand. They're a wonderful brand, great watches, but they could have been even better if they had been open-minded enough to take to believe the Greek who was bearing gifts to them really was delivering a gift. But they couldn't see it, and they didn't want. Now that's, I think, quite endemic within parts of the industry, and I think still is to some extent, albeit I think it's beginning to change. And the more external people, the more people from outside the industry who come into the industry and rise through it and bring ideas from other sectors, I think the more it's beginning to change. And indeed, the more the consumer becomes demanding, and the more demand-led the industry becomes, as opposed to supply-led, which it's been for most of its existence, I think the more innovative changes you're going to see, because it can't survive without changing. And I do think that we are at the start of a new sort of period of luxury watches, which will be very different to the previous 20, 30 years.
I couldn't agree more. If you guys enjoyed that clip, please do me a huge favor before you go and head over to our Into the Mind podcast official page, where we have the raw, uncut Into the Mind podcast, and hit that subscribe button. And the more subscribers we get, the more incredible guests we can get on the show. I really appreciate you guys for watching. Thank you so much. And I'll see you all real soon.